I have a question for you. Have you ever been to Warped Tour? I hope your answer is yes, because it's never coming back and was the greatest music festival to ever exist. If you're watching this, my deepest hope is you got a chance to go at least once. But if you weren't so lucky and never got to go, allow me to paint a picture of how it felt to attend the iconic Vans Warped Tour. For kids who shopped at Hot Topic, going to Warped Tour was like Christmas, except way better, because you got to see all your favorite bands in one place, hang out with your friends, and escape your parents. It was the one day out of the year where kids immersed in alternative culture got to feel at home instead of feeling alienated. Upon walking in, you'd see a giant inflatable. I'm talking big, you can't miss this thing. And the inflatable gave you information such as what time bands would be playing and what stage they'd be playing on. But by the time you got inside the venue, usually around 11:30, some bands were already playing. So you'd have to run in, reference the inflatable, then sprint to the stage your favorite band was playing on. The whole environment was chaotic, out of control, and everything I wanted as a teenager. I have so many great memories surrounding Warped Tour, from making my mom drive me to getting socked in the face by random strangers. But my favorite memory by far is this. So for many of the years I attended Warped Tour, they had this thing going on where you could drink as many monsters as you wanted for free, which sounds insane because it was. But no matter how old I get, I'll never forget the year I crushed 2 monsters back to back and then immediately entered a mosh pit for this wild band called The Chariot. I was an animal out there, and I felt so alive, despite it being over 100 degrees on a blacktop in the middle of summer. But fast forward to 2022, and that's all Warped Tour is. Just a collection of memories. But when it comes to the death of Warped Tour, I have one question. Why? If everyone loved it that much, why'd it have to end? To get an understanding of why Warped Tour fell, and whether or not it could have been prevented, we'll have to go back to 1995, when Kevin Lyman founded Warped Tour. On August 4th, 1995, the first Warped Tour show took place. It was held in Salt Lake City, Utah, at a venue called Salt Lake Air. But this show, and the entirety of the 95 Warped Tour run, was far from glamorous. In fact, it was so bad, this is what Kevin had to say about their initial outing. We probably should have played 2 to 3 dates and gone home. But Kevin isn't a normal person who makes normal decisions. So after Warped Tour's first run in 1995, he took a hard look at things and saw the tour had far underperformed their expectations and noted they actually lost money when it was all said and done. Where most people would see this as a logical stopping point, Kevin, with his do-it-yourself punk mentality, saw it as just another challenge to overcome. So he immediately began searching for solutions. But before we get any further, I need to give Warped Tour's founder, Kevin Lyman, a proper character introduction, because this whole thing wouldn't exist if it weren't for him. Before starting Warped Tour, Kevin was just your average working class guy trying to get by in life. He worked in a number of clubs throughout Los Angeles, California, putting on all kinds of shows and promoting artists. And he did this for over a decade. At one point, he ran up to 320 shows a year for a company called Golden Voice that went on to found Coachella. But when Kevin was working for them, Golden Voice was the premier underground promoter in Los Angeles. They basically worked with all the bands no one wanted to promote or book, which began with punk and speed metal shows in the late 80s, but by 1991 transferred over to the alternative scene, with the rise of bands like Jane's Addiction and Red Hot Chili Peppers. At this point, in the early 90s, the LA alternative scene was exploding, and Kevin was right there in the middle of it all. That year in 1991, alternative rock band Jane's Addiction decided to call it quits. To commemorate their time as a band, they went on a monstrous farewell tour, but in the process, accidentally created a music festival you've probably heard of, called Lollapalooza, and Kevin was asked to help out and be part of it. He served as the initial stage manager for the tour, but also kept his job in the LA clubs so he could have an idea of what was going on in the underground. But after managing Lollapalooza for a number of years, Kevin was forced to make a tough decision. At this point, he had a wife and a child on the way, and for a split second, he thought about trying to find a real job. One with benefits, insurance, the type of job your parents always said you should get. because more than anything, he wanted to support his wife and future daughter, but didn't feel right stepping away from something he was so passionate about. But in 1995, he saw an opportunity he couldn't pass up. Throughout the early to mid-90s, skateboarding and extreme sports blew up to an unprecedented level of popularity. And with this, Kevin thought to himself, skating is awesome, but what if we combined it with a concert environment? So he slowly started exploring this idea by pulling stunts like paying Red Hot Chili Peppers $250 to perform on a skate ramp, or this one time he had Pennywise and Social Distortion play on a mountain while people snowboarded. But it was in March 1995 when Kevin had an epiphany that changed his life. He says the concept for Warped Tour had already been formulating for many years by this time, but it was at this particular event called a Board Aid, where people snowboard for various charities, that Kevin felt this ultimate sense of clarity. Earlier that day, someone mentioned that this thing called the X Games was being formed, which would only further popularize skating and extreme sports. And at that moment, he knew what had to be done. Kids were snowboarding, throwing snowballs, and most importantly, there was a stage set up and a band playing during all of it. It became obvious to him that the convergence of music and extreme sports was the future. He thought, if we don't put on our own event like this, we'll be working for somebody else forever. Sitting in the snow next to his friend Greg Teal, Kevin said, I think we should do a tour where we bring skateboarding and music together. At that exact moment, the real job he thought about getting was put on the back burner, and got to work coordinating the first Warped Tour. When first trying to come up with a name for Warped Tour, Kevin thought about calling it The Bomb, but due to an unfortunate event in Oklahoma around that same time, he decided the name was distasteful and would garner negative attention. So with permission, he borrowed the name Warped from a magazine he used to work for. But the first Warped Tour run in 1995 was practically unrecognizable compared to what it would become. Turnouts were minimal, ticket sales low, and they were operating on a basically non-existent budget. Even though some bands received exposure through the tour, everyone involved was taking a financial bath. But there was one thing that saved them from going under. This shoe right here, Vans. However, one thing most people don't know is that it was almost called the Calvin Klein Warped Tour. It's really got a ring to it, huh? But all jokes aside, Kevin's ex-partner tried to convince him that Calvin Klein would be the best sponsor for Warped Tour, which of course didn't end up happening because Kevin knew Calvin Klein didn't mesh well with Warped's punk mentality and knew they needed a brand that better fit the tour's image. It was around this time he got a call from a guy who was trying to help raise money for the tour, and he said, Vans wants to meet with you, Kevin. So he hopped in his car, drove down to the Vans warehouse, and met with Walter Skonfeld, one of Vans' original CEOs. After some discussion, they discovered they were in similar boats. Kevin wanted to put on a tour, but had no money or sponsor. And Vans wanted to expand their customer base and brand image, but lacked an appropriate channel to do so. Within 15 minutes of meeting, a verbal agreement was made that Vans would become the sponsor of Warped Tour. Once they secured Vans as a sponsor and embarked on the next run of Warped in 1996, it was clear they were onto something big. With a larger budget, more time, and more planning, they were able to take Warped from a failing music festival to a staple in alternative culture in just a number of years. And the reason for that is, Warped Tour was different from any other music festival I've ever seen, because it was truly a launchpad for many bands' careers. A lot of bands who got huge from playing Warped prior to that had very few eyes on them. And I'm not talking about small, independent bands. I'm talking about bands like Paramore, Sum 41, Blink-182. Bands such as them were able to grow to absurd heights thanks to Warped's exposure. And as those bands grew, it also helped Warped Tour grow. So it was almost like a never-ending cycle. But when Warped was starting out, the lineups were quite a bit different from what they'd evolve into. The early bands consisted mostly of skate punk and third wave ska, but as time wore on, they began to focus more on pop punk and metalcore acts, such as Of Mice and Men, Set Your Goals, and Bring Me the Horizon. But the most unique aspect of Warped was how they treated the bands. Like most festivals, Warped had multiple stages for bands to play. However, what made it so different is that even if your band played on the main stage every single day, you'd still be playing at a different time on each date. For example, a band like A Day to Remember might be the last band to play one day, but the next day, they could be playing at 11:30 in the morning as you're walking in. This gave every band a fair chance to shine and get the exposure they wanted. By the early 2000s, non-punk music had become prevalent in Warped's lineups, much to the dismay of true punk fans who began attending because of the mostly punk lineups in the past. But while they did receive some criticism for incorporating non-punk music, the tour was still growing rapidly with each passing year. At the peak of its success, Warped drew in upwards of 700,000 fans every summer. They'd roll into town, set up their circus, then tear it down, all in the same day, and do the same thing the next day. But despite their continued success, the 2000s brought along something that would prove to be detrimental for Warped: social media. Because by the 2000s, Warped Tour lineups were littered with bands who fans felt didn't fit the bill. Acts such as Eminem or Katy Perry. And social media now gave fans a platform to share these thoughts. On top of this, criticism was growing each year from people who attended the festival in the past, upset about how much it had changed. But once the 2010s came along, the lineups became so far removed from what they once were. It became pretty much all metalcore, pop punk, and emo, with an occasional punk or ska band thrown in there to make the OG fans happy. The saddest part about the decline of Warped Tour is that I fully believe it could have been prevented, because one of the main reasons Kevin began entertaining the idea of winding it down was because of a loss in community. When Warped began, Kevin toured with a lot of his friends, and as a result, this created a community feel right off the bat. It felt like everyone liked each other, or at the very least, was supportive. And that's what Warped needed to function, an active community. But as years passed, new bands came in that Kevin had never met before. And by this point, Kevin was in his 50s, so being a friend to these new bands wasn't really an option. He was of course friendly, but all the younger bands tended to see him more as a mentor or disciplinary figure, rather than a friend, which really changed up the dynamic of the tour. Because in years past, if a band had an issue, they'd just come to Kevin and talk about it. But once social media came along, bands would post all their grievances and issues with the tour on there, instead of talking face to face. Social media also gave bands a means to be more judgmental than ever before. Because back in the day, bands hardly knew anything about each other prior to meeting. But with social media, bands could be like, oh, their music sucks, or we disagree with them on this super specific social issue. And because of this, bands sometimes wouldn't interact, which is detrimental if you're going for a community feel. And as the 2010s wore on, some bands wouldn't even consider playing Warped Tour because they didn't want to be known as a Warped-esque band. And all of these factors combined effectively destroyed the community Kevin had worked so hard to build. On November 15th, 2017, Kevin announced that the 2018 Warped Tour would be the final cross-country run of Warped Tour, putting an end to the annual punk rock summer camp. The saddest part about Warped Tour's fall isn't necessarily that it's over. Don't get me wrong, I'm insanely sad about that, but what gets me is that the scene which helped Warped Tour grow into what it was is also the same scene that ripped the festival apart from within. But what do you think? Is it fair to say that Warped Tour eventually destroyed itself, or would you say it was something else? Let me know down in the comments below and check out this next video. Thank you, I'll see you soon.